All right, settle in, folks, because you are not going to believe the story I'm about to tell you. Stick with me right to the very end, because what my own grandmother did, the secret she kept for nearly a century, well, it nearly blew my entire family to smithereens. I swear on my grave, some days I still can't believe it all happened. But it did. And it all started with a simple request, a whisper from my 99-year-old Grandma Eleanor on what we all knew was her deathbed. My grandma, Eleanor, bless her heart, was the kind of woman you read about in books, or maybe saw in those old black and white movies. She was the matriarch, the rock, the one who'd seen it all. The Great Depression, World War II, men on the moon, you name it. She'd raised 3 kids, buried a husband she adored, and doted on more grandkids and great-grandkids than you could shake a stick at. She was tough as nails, but had a heart as big as Texas. Or so I thought. I always thought I knew her, you know? Knew her stories, her little quirks, the way she'd hum off-key when she was baking her famous apple pie. But Lord have mercy, I didn't know the half of it. Not even a quarter. It was a cold February, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you long for spring. Grandma Eleanor had been fading for a while. 99 years is a long time to walk this earth, and her body was just plain tired. We'd all been taking turns sitting with her at the hospice. Me, my mom Carol, her eldest, my Uncle Joe, and Aunt Patty. The grandkids, too, popping in and out. It was a sad time, but also full of a strange kind of peace, sharing old memories, laughing through tears. Grandma was mostly quiet, sleeping a lot, but every now and then, her eyes would flutter open, sharp and clear as they'd always been, and she'd offer a small smile or squeeze a hand. It was on one of my shifts, a Tuesday afternoon, I think. The room was dim, just the hum of some machine in the corner and the scent of antiseptic mixed with the roses my cousin brought. Grandma had been asleep for hours, and I was just reading a book, trying to keep my mind from wandering down sad paths. Suddenly her voice, raspy and weak, cut through the quiet. "Sarah, honey," I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Grandma? I'm here. What do you need?" Her eyes, pale blue like faded denim, found mine. There was an urgency in them I hadn't seen in weeks. "Sarah," she whispered, and I had to lean in close to hear. "There's something you need to do for me. Only you." "Of course, Grandma. Anything." My heart did a little flutter. What could it be? "In the attic," she breathed, each word an effort. "My old house, the cedar chest, under the eaves on the left, there's a little blue tin box, small, with forget-me-nots painted on it." She paused, gathering strength. "You find it, Sarah, and whatever you do, you open it, alone. Promise me." "A blue tin box?" I repeated, trying to picture it. Her attic was a treasure trove of forgotten things, a dusty museum of our family's past. "Okay, Grandma, I promise. I'll find it. But why alone?" A flicker of something I couldn't quite name crossed her face. Fear? Regret? Just promise me, child. "I promise," I said, patting her frail hand. "I'll go tomorrow." She seemed to relax then, a tiny sigh escaping her lips. She closed her eyes and drifted off again. I sat there for a long time, her words echoing in my head. A secret mission from Grandma. It felt momentous. What could possibly be in that little blue tin box that was so important, so secret, that only I could see it? My mind raced with possibilities. Old love letters? A hidden stash of cash from her pin money days? Back in my day, women were resourceful like that. The next day, after checking in on Mom, I drove over to Grandma's old house. It was already sold, the closing just a few weeks away. But we still had access to clear out her belongings. The place felt empty, hollowed out, like a seashell without its creature. I'd spent so much of my childhood there, the scent of her baking, the sound of Grandpa's laughter. Lord, it was hard being in there. Up in the attic, it was just as I remembered. Dusty, cluttered, smelling of old paper and cedar. I navigated through stacks of boxes, past forgotten toys and moth-eaten clothes, until I reached the eaves on the left. And there it was, tucked behind an old hat box, just as she'd described. A small blue tin box, the paint chipped, with faded forget-me-nots on the lid. It wasn't locked. My heart was pounding like a drum. This felt almost sacrilegious, like I was prying into something I shouldn't. But I'd made a promise. I sat down on an old trunk, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from the grimy window, and took a deep breath. With trembling fingers, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, were just a few things. A tiny pair of baby booties, knitted from the softest white wool, so small they could have fit a doll. A pressed flower, a pansy, its colors faded but still recognizable. A single, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman I barely recognized as my grandmother. She must have been only 16 or 17. Beautiful, but with a sadness in her eyes that tugged at my heart. And underneath it all, a folded, brittle piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was a birth certificate. But the name of the mother wasn't Eleanor May Johnson, the name she took when she married Grandpa. It was Eleanor May Pruitt, her maiden name. And the father's name, it was blank. The date of birth was 1940, 2 full years before she even met my grandfather. And the baby's name, it wasn't my mom, or Uncle Joe, or Aunt Patty. It was Baby Boy Pruitt. I stared at it, the words blurring. My sainted grandmother, the woman who preached honesty above all else, the woman who was the very pillar of our family, had a secret child? A child born out of wedlock? A child none of us knew anything about? And she never told a soul? Not her husband? Not her children? Lord have mercy. What else was she hiding? This wasn't just some old love letter. This was a whole other life, a whole other person. My mind reeled. Who was this baby? And what on earth had happened to him? The air in the attic suddenly felt cold, suffocating, and I knew deep in my gut that this little blue box was about to change everything. That was the last straw for my innocent view of our family history. It was gone, replaced by 1,000 questions. I must have sat there in that dusty attic for a good hour, just staring at that birth certificate, my mind spinning like a tilt-a-whirl at the county fair. A baby boy. Born in 1940. My grandmother would have been just shy of 18. Back in my day, well, even before my day, a girl in her situation. Lord, the shame, the scandal. It was a different world then, but still, to keep a secret like that for almost 80 years, it was beyond anything I could comprehend. My first instinct was to rush back to the hospice, to confront Grandma Eleanor, demand answers. But how could I? She was so frail, hanging on by a thread. Could my heart, or hers, even handle such a conversation? What if the shock? No, I couldn't risk it. Not yet. I carefully packed the tin box into my purse, my hands still shaking. Driving home, every traffic light seemed to mock me. Every passing car filled with people living ordinary lives, untouched by the kind of bombshell that had just landed in mine. What was I supposed to do with this? Who could I tell? My mom. Carol. She was Eleanor's firstborn, the one who'd always been closest to her. She had a right to know. But how do you tell your 70-something mother that her own mother, the woman she idolized, had a secret child she never spoke of? There's No greeting card for that. Let me tell you. I found Mom in her kitchen, kneading bread dough, a therapy she'd relied on for years. The rhythmic push and pull always seemed to calm her. I sat down at her old Formica table, the one I'd eaten 1,000 childhood meals at, and just blurted it out. Mom, I went to Grandma's attic. I found something. She wiped her floury hands on her apron, her brow furrowed with concern. What is it, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, I said, my voice trembling a little. I pulled out the tin box, laid the contents on the table. The tiny booties, the faded photo, the pressed flower, and finally, the birth certificate. Mom picked it up, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. She read it once, then twice. The color drained from her face. She sank into the chair opposite me, the bread dough forgotten. This can't be, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Baby boy Pruitt. Mama never... Her eyes welled up. Who is this, Sarah? What does this mean? I said gently. I think it means Grandma had a baby before she met Grandpa. A baby she gave up, or something. Gave up? Mom's voice rose, a note of hysteria creeping in. My mother. Gave up a child. No, she loved children. She couldn't. She looked at me, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. She lied to us all these years. Her whole life. It was built on a lie? The anger came next, swift and fierce. How could she? Mom slammed her fist on the table, making the tin box rattle. All those lectures about honesty, about family, and this whole time she was hiding this. A brother? I might have had an older brother. The betrayal cut her deep. I could see it in the raggedness of her breath, the clenching of her jaw. It was a terrible afternoon. We cried, we raged, we questioned everything we thought we knew about Eleanor. Was she truly the woman we loved? Or had we only loved a carefully constructed facade? It felt like the very foundations of our family were crumbling. Mom called Uncle Joe and Aunt Patty. Their reactions were a mixed bag. Uncle Joe, always the pragmatic one, was shocked, but more curious. Well, I'll be, was his first reaction. A secret baby, huh? Wonder what happened to him. Aunt Patty, on the other hand, was devastated, much like Mom. She felt betrayed, lied. Tomo, I don't think I can even look at her the same way again, she sobbed over the phone. The family, once so tightly knit, felt like it was unraveling. Sides were being taken. Some, like me, felt a strange mix of shock and a deep, aching sadness for what young Eleanor must have gone through. Others, like Mom and Aunt Patty, were consumed by the sense of betrayal. What if this secret son was still out there? Did he have a claim on Grandma's meager estate? Not that there was much, but still, the thought hung in the air. Later that week, I went back to the hospice. Grandma Eleanor was weaker, more distant. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, the tin box heavy in my purse. I couldn't bring myself to say anything about it directly. But I did ask, Grandma, back when you were a young girl, were things very hard for you sometimes? Her eyes, clouded with age and medication, focused on me for a moment. A flicker of something unreadable passed through them. Life is full of hard choices, child, she whispered. Sometimes there are no good options, only paths you have to take. And then she drifted off again. It wasn't a confession, not really. But it was something. I knew I couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about Grandma's secret anymore. It was about a missing piece of our family. It was about a man, an uncle I never knew, who might still be alive. Tucked inside the tin box with the birth certificate was a tiny folded note, almost overlooked. It was brittle, the ink faded. All it said was, "Forgive me. He looked like his father, the apple orchard. J.H." J.H.? The apple orchard? What did that mean? Could J.H. be the father? Or someone else connected to this? My grandpa's name was Arthur Miller. Nothing close to J.H. This only deepened the mystery. I started digging. Old town records, census data, anything I could find from that era related to the Pruitt family or local apple orchards. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack nearly 80 years old. Most of Grandma's contemporaries were long gone. Days turned into weeks. The tension in the family was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every phone call felt strained. Every family gathering, though there were few of those then, was overshadowed by this unspoken thing. Then, a breakthrough. Or what I thought was a breakthrough. In an old local directory from 1939, I found a listing for Henderson orchards on the outskirts of town. Henderson. J.H.? Could it be? It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. The orchard was still there, though much smaller, surrounded by suburban sprawl. An old farmhouse stood at its heart, weathered but proud. With my heart in my throat, I knocked on the door. An elderly man, probably in his late 70s, opened it. He had kind eyes, a bit like my Uncle Joe's. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gentle. I took a deep breath. "My name is Sarah Miller. My grandmother. Her maiden name was Eleanor Pruitt. I found this old photograph of her." I showed him the picture from the tin box. "I was wondering if the name Henderson, or perhaps J.H., means anything to you in connection with her from a long time ago." He looked at the photo of young Eleanor, then at me, and his face went pale. "Eleanor Pruitt," he murmured, almost to himself. "My father. His name was James Henderson. He always said there was a woman he loved, a woman named Eleanor. From before the war, he said he wronged her terribly." The man looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sudden dawning comprehension, but he never told me the whole story. He just said, "She wasn't who everyone thought she was, and that he'd lost her." Lord, you won't believe what he said next, but it stuck with me all these years. He said, "She carried a secret that could break a saint." "A secret that could break a saint?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air of that old farmhouse kitchen, heavy as a humid summer day. This Mr. Henderson, Jr., for he introduced himself as Tom Henderson, James's son, invited me in. He poured us both a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. The resemblance to my Uncle Joe was uncanny around the eyes. It sent a shiver down my spine. Could this be it? Was I sitting across from a relative I never knew existed? Tom told me what little he knew. His father, James Henderson, had been deeply in love with a young woman named Eleanor Pruitt back in the late 1930s. They'd met at a church social, he thought. James was from a farming family, the Hendersons of Henderson Orchards, solid folks but not wealthy. Eleanor, from what Tom recalled his father saying, was a bit more refined, her family perhaps with aspirations. My father always said she was the prettiest girl in the county, Tom said, a wistful look in his eyes. He was heartbroken when she disappeared from his life. He said she just vanished. He thought she'd run off, maybe married someone else, someone her family approved of more. Disappeared? I asked. He never knew about a baby. Tom shook his head slowly, never mentioned one. Not to me, anyway. He just carried this sadness, this guilt. I wronged her, he'd say. I wasn't good enough or brave enough. He never elaborated. James Henderson had passed away 10 years prior, taking his side of the story to his grave. This threw a whole new wrench in the works. If James Henderson was the father, and he didn't know about the baby, then Grandma Eleanor's story, or what I assumed was her story about giving up a child for adoption, suddenly had holes. Why would she keep the baby a secret from the father, too? Unless he was the one who wanted it kept secret. Or maybe he wasn't the father at all, and JH from the note meant something else entirely. My head was spinning again. That was the last straw, I thought. This is getting too complicated. I thanked Tom Henderson, promising to keep in touch if I learned anything more. He seemed as keen as I was to understand the past. Driving away from the orchard, I felt more confused than ever. The narrative I'd started to build in my mind, a young girl, a difficult choice, a secret adoption, was now murky, uncertain. Back home, I shared this new development with Mom. She listened, her face grim. So, this James Henderson didn't know? Or he pretended not to know? What kind of man does that? Her anger at her mother was now tinged with a new bitterness towards this shadowy figure from the past. The strain on the family was getting worse. Uncle Joe, ever the pragmatist, suggested hiring a private investigator. Aunt Patty was still barely speaking to Mom, feeling like her whole childhood had been a lie. Even my own kids were starting to ask questions, sensing the tension. "What's wrong with Grandma Carol?" my daughter asked me. "She seems so sad." How could I explain this tangled mess to a new generation? Grandma Eleanor, meanwhile, was slipping further away. She was mostly unresponsive now. The doctors said it wouldn't be long. The thought that she might die before we understood any of this, before any kind of healing could happen, was a heavy weight. I went back to the tin box, searching for any other clue, anything I might have missed. The pressed pansy, the booties, they offered no answers. Then I remembered Grandma Eleanor's cedar chest, the one the tin box was near. She'd always kept her most precious mementos in there. Old letters, photographs, her wedding veil. Maybe, just maybe, there was something else. The next time I was at Grandma's house, supposedly sorting things for the estate sale, I made a beeline for that cedar chest. I'd been through it before, but superficially. This time, I was on a mission. I carefully lifted out layers of old linens, baby clothes, my mom's, I recognized a tiny dress, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbons. Most were from Grandpa Arthur, written during the war. Sweet, loving letters. Then, at the very bottom, under a false panel I hadn't noticed before, I found another, smaller bundle of letters. These were different. The handwriting on the envelopes wasn't Grandpa's. It was a spidery, old-fashioned script. And they weren't addressed to Eleanor Miller, or even Eleanor Pruitt. They were addressed to Miss E. Pruitt, but the letters inside, the ones from Eleanor, were signed simply, "Your E." And the letters to her were from her own mother, my great-grandmother, Matilda Pruitt. My heart hammered against my ribs. Great-grandma Matilda. I remembered her vaguely from my childhood. A stern, imposing woman, always dressed in dark colors, with a mouth like a prune. She wasn't exactly the warm, cuddly type. In fact, back in my day, kids were terrified of her. I untied the ribbon. The letters were dated 1939 and 1940. As I read, a new, horrifying chapter of the story began to unfold. Great-Grandma Matilda had discovered young Eleanor's pregnancy. The shame, the scandal. Matilda was beside herself. "You have brought disgrace upon this family," one letter thundered. "This will not stand. Arrangements will be made." Arrangements? What arrangements? The letters from Eleanor were heartbreaking, pleading, desperate. "Mama, please, he loves me, we can get married." And Matilda's cold reply, "He is not suitable. He is beneath us. This folly ends now." There was talk of sending Eleanor away to visit relatives until the situation was resolved. It became clear that James Henderson, the boy from the apple orchard, was indeed the father. But Great-Grandma Matilda had forbidden the match, deeming him and his family socially unacceptable. She was a terrible snob, that woman, and she was ruthless. She wrote about ensuring the problem would be taken care of discreetly. She mentioned a home for unwed mothers, a place where Eleanor would go, and then the baby would be placed with a good family. So, Grandma Eleanor had been forced to give up her child. But it wasn't her choice. It was her mother's. The betrayal wasn't just Eleanor's to us. It was Matilda's to her own daughter. This shed a whole new light on Grandma's lifelong secret. It wasn't just shame. It was trauma, forced upon her by her own mother. The family, when I shared this, was stunned into a new kind of silence. The anger at Grandma Eleanor began to shift, to soften, replaced by a dawning, horrified pity for what she must have endured as a scared, pregnant teenager, at the mercy of a domineering mother. Mom was particularly shaken. My grandmother did that to her own daughter. "To my mother," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Lord have mercy. No wonder Mama never spoke of it. A few days later, Grandma Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was a somber affair, the recent revelations hanging heavy in the air. There was grief, of course, but also a profound sense of unresolved questions, of a life story still incomplete. After the funeral, we gathered at Mom's house. The lawyers had called, mentioning the will reading would be next week. But none of us were thinking about that. We were thinking about the empty space Eleanor left, and the ghost of the baby boy she'd lost. That evening, driven by some instinct, I went back to Grandma's house one last time before the new owners took possession. I felt like I needed to walk through it, to say a final goodbye. I found myself in her bedroom, standing before her old mahogany dresser. I don't know why, but I started opening drawers, running my hands along the smooth wood. In the back of the bottom drawer, my fingers brushed against something loose, a small, wooden panel. I pressed it, and it clicked open, revealing a hidden compartment. My breath caught. Inside, nestled on velvet, was a small leather-bound diary, no bigger than my hand. It had a tiny brass lock. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my purse, looking for a bobby pin. Anything to pick that tiny lock. It sprang open with surprising ease. I opened the diary to the first page. The ink was faded, the handwriting girlish but firm. The first entry, dated October 1940, read, "They made me do it. They took him from me. They told me he was gone, that he didn't make it." My blood ran cold. But I saw him, just for a moment, before they pulled me away. I saw my baby boy. He was alive. I know he was alive. What in God's name had my great-grandmother truly done? Was it possible the baby hadn't been adopted out after all? Or was this just the desperate hope of a grieving young mother? He was alive. I know he was alive. Those words from Grandma Eleanor's hidden diary echoed in my mind for days, a haunting refrain. If the baby hadn't died, as Great-Grandma Matilda had evidently told Eleanor, and if he wasn't formally adopted, through the channels Matilda had alluded to in her cruel letters, then what had happened to him? This was getting deeper and darker than I could ever have imagined. If you think this is shocking, folks, you just wait. This next part, well, it nearly did me in. I devoured that diary. Over the next few entries were sporadic, filled with the raw anguish of a young mother torn from her child, gasping for breath in a sea of lies. Matilda had told Eleanor her son was stillborn, or had died shortly after birth. The story seemed to shift, designed to crush any hope. Eleanor, drugged, from a difficult labor and emotionally shattered, was in no state to fight. But that one glimpse, that fleeting moment she believed she'd seen her living child, had planted a seed of doubt, a tortured hope that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The diary detailed how, weeks later, after Eleanor was brought back, home, broken and silent, she overheard snippets of conversations between her parents, whispers of a cousin out west, childless, a blessing in disguise, better for everyone this way. Slowly, horrifically, Eleanor began to piece together a different truth. Her mother hadn't arranged an adoption through an agency. She'd orchestrated a private secret handover. Great-Grandma Matilda, in her twisted, controlling way, had given her own grandson away to a distant, childless cousin, someone the family had little contact with, to ensure the secret was buried deep and the shame would never touch the Pruitts directly. And then, she'd cut off all contact with that cousin. Lord have mercy, the cruelty of it. To tell her daughter the baby was dead, while secretly shipping him off like an unwanted parcel. That wasn't just being stern. That was pure evil. My heart ached for young Eleanor, trapped, powerless, grieving for a child she was told was dead, yet suspecting he was alive somewhere beyond her reach. The JH in the note from the tin box. It clicked. It wasn't James Henderson, the father. It was likely John or Joseph or some other J initial for the husband of this distant cousin, the man who would raise her son. The apple orchard reference was likely a poignant memory of her time with James, the baby's father, a connection to the life that was stolen from her. The diary entries became less frequent as years passed. Eleanor met and married my grandpa Arthur. She had Mom, then Uncle Joe, then Aunt Patty. She built a life, a good life, filled with love. But the diary revealed that the ghost of her lost son never left her. There were entries on his birthdays, filled with quiet sorrow. He would be 10 today, one read. I wonder if he has my eyes. Another, years later. Is he happy? Does he ever think of a mother he never knew? She'd even tried to find him. In the 1960s, after Great-Grandma Matilda had passed away and her oppressive shadow lifted somewhat, Eleanor had made discreet inquiries. But the cousin had moved, changed her name through marriage, vanished without a trace. The trail went cold. The adoption story she'd vaguely alluded to on her deathbed, the one she hinted at with me, was her way of trying to confess, of trying to make sense of a truth too painful to fully articulate, a truth she herself only knew in fragments and suspicions. With this new, devastating knowledge, the family dynamic shifted again. All anger towards Grandma Eleanor evaporated, replaced by a profound, shared grief and a burning indignation towards Great-Grandma Matilda. How could one woman inflict so much pain on her own flesh and blood? It was almost biblical in its cruelty. Uncle Joe, true to his word, hired a genealogist, a specialist in tracing lost family members. Armed with the few clues from the diary, the vague mention of cousin out west, the approximate time frame, the genealogist went to work. It took weeks, painstaking research through old records, distant family trees, forgotten archives. We all waited, on tenterhooks. And then, the call came. The genealogist had found him. Or rather, found his family. Eleanor's son, whose birth name was indeed Baby Boy Pruitt, but who had been renamed Michael by his adoptive parents, the distant cousin and her husband, whose surname was Peterson, had lived a full life. He'd married, had children of his own. He'd passed away 5 years ago from a heart condition. A wave of sorrow washed over us. We'd found him, only to lose him again. But the genealogist had more news. Michael Peterson had 2 surviving children. A son, David, and a daughter, Laura, and they lived only a few states over. What do you do with news like that? Do you call these strangers out of the blue? Hi, Your grandmother was our grandmother's secret long-lost sister-in-law, and your father was our mother's secret half-brother. It sounded insane. After much debate, Mom, Uncle Joe, Aunt Patty, and I decided to write a letter. A carefully worded, gentle letter, explaining who we were, what we'd discovered, and sharing copies of Eleanor's diary entries and the birth certificate. We expressed our sorrow at Michael's passing, and said we would understand if they wanted no contact, but that we were open to meeting, to sharing stories. We sent it off with a prayer. 2 weeks later, an email arrived. It was from David Peterson. He said he and his sister Laura were in shock. They knew their father, Michael, was adopted, but he'd never known anything about his birth mother or her family. He'd always wondered, always felt a piece of him was missing. They wanted to meet. And so, on a sunny Saturday in late spring, we did. We rented a private room in a quiet restaurant halfway between our homes. Walking in, seeing David and Laura for the first time, it was surreal. David had Eleanor's kind eyes. There was no mistaking it. Laura had a smile that reminded me so much of pictures of young grandma. It was like looking at familiar ghosts, yet they were vibrant and real. It was awkward at first, of course. Strangers, bound by this incredible, painful secret. But then we started talking. We shared photos of Eleanor, of Michael. They told us about their father. A good man, a loving father and grandfather. We told them about Eleanor, about her quiet strength, her hidden sorrow. Tears were shed, yes, but there were also moments of laughter, of connection. They were family. Our family. Expanded in a way none of us could have foreseen. The ruin that Grandma Eleanor's lie, or rather the lie forced upon her, had threatened to bring to our family was slowly, miraculously, transforming into something else. Healing. Understanding. Forgiveness, not for Eleanor, but for the cruel circumstances that had shaped her life. And then came the final twist, the one that, I swear on my grave, none of us saw coming. After we'd sorted through Grandma Eleanor's estate, the small farmhouse sold, her few possessions divided or donated, the lawyer called us in for a final meeting. "There's one more item," he said, looking a bit perplexed. "Your grandmother left a safe deposit box. We only just gained access. It wasn't listed with her other assets." He placed a surprisingly heavy, old metal box on the table. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks and stacks of old bills. 5s, 10s, 20s. Not a king's ransom, but a significant amount. More money than any of us thought Grandma Eleanor could possibly have saved. And with it, a final letter, in her familiar, shaky hand. "To my family," it began. "If you are reading this, then the truth of my past, of my lost son, has come to light, as I always prayed and feared it might. This money, I saved it over many, many years, a little here, a little there, from my egg money, from small inheritances, from scrimping and saving in ways no one knew. It was for him, for my Michael, in case I ever found him, or he found me, a way to try and make amends for the life he was denied with me, for the silence I was forced to keep." She went on, "If he is found, and if he has a family, I want them to have this. To know his mother never forgot him, never stopped loving him. And if there is any left, or if he is beyond its reach, then it is for all of you, my beloved children and grandchildren. Use it to heal. Use it to come together. Forgive an old woman her secrets, born of pain and a mother's broken heart. Family is everything. Don't ever let anything truly break it." We all just sat there, stunned, tears streaming down our faces. David and Laura Peterson were with us, having become part of these final family proceedings. The money, after all these years, would go to Eleanor's grandchildren, including her newfound ones, David and Laura. It wasn't about the amount. It was the gesture, the love, the decades of silent atonement it represented. That money helped. David's son with college, and Laura put a down payment on a small cottage. For our side of the family, it helped mend some of the financial strains that had added to the tension. But more than that, it was a symbol of Eleanor's enduring love, a final act that brought everyone together, closing the circle of her long, complicated life. Our family wasn't ruined. It was changed, yes. Wounded, certainly. But ultimately, it was enlarged, enriched, and brought to a deeper understanding of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds that tie us together, even across generations and secrets. It took a whole lot of heartache, I tell ya, but in the end, our family found its way back, bigger and stronger. What do you think? Could you forgive a secret that deep, knowing the story behind it? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, folks. And if you enjoyed this roller coaster of a story from this old gal, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe.